Well, I want to thank everyone for your time today. I've really enjoyed all of the sessions so far. Thank you for the introduction earlier, Lisa. It's such a pleasure to be here sharing with you today. And while I wish we were all there in person, like a typical Oley conference, I'm grateful for the opportunity to offer this program virtually, because I do think that it gives us more consumers, clinicians, and others an opportunity to join us and learn from each other. First, I must give a very special thank you to Peggy Gunter. Peggy gave a talk at Aspen this year, and while I didn't get to see it, I know that Andrea did and some of the other Oley staff, and they asked if I'd be willing to do something similar. So I asked Peggy's permission, and well, here we are. The only thing I'm going to share on this next slide is I'll mention, since people have been sharing their age, I'm 46, I'll be 47 in November. I'm married to a very loving husband, Brad, and all of my this information will be available after the session today. So you know how to reach me. Feel free to reach out to me on social media, text or email. I definitely don't have any cool YouTube videos, so I'm looking forward to seeing Hannah and Mickey's as well. Okay, so I figured it would be helpful to give you some context and start by sharing my nutrition support timeline. So when I was asked to do this, share the things I learned over the past, 10 plus years, I had to take a step back and be like, wow, I've actually been on nutrition support for over 10 years now. And that kind of freaked me out a little just thinking about it, because it just seems like I've been doing it forever. But at the same time, it was overwhelming when I was faced with the fact that, wow, I've been doing this for 10 years. So I will say both Mickey and Hannah's stories resonated with me because, especially Mickey's, because it was very similar to mine in that I had an acute onset of symptoms. I was working at the CDC and woke up one day with what I thought was just, a regular GI virus, the kind that goes away after 24 to 48 hours. But it didn't. And after a week of not being able to keep anything down, I ended up in the hospital. I had my gallbladder removed, which really didn't provide any relief or improvement. And then I was given a test called a gastric emptying study, which confirmed I had gastroparesis. I was diagnosed with that, was told I'd feel better by Thanksgiving and would be able to have, a nice Thanksgiving meal with my family. Well, I'll spare you the details of the other hospitalizations and surgeries that fall, except to say that I came home from the hospital on home parenteral nutrition. That's IV nutrition, with the hopes that giving my GI system a rest would help things return to normal. I gained the 30 plus pounds that I lost since I got sick back and started feeling a little more like myself, except I couldn't eat. And I was adapting to this new treatment therapy. And so from mid-November to early December 2010, I tried to eat. I begged for my PICC line to be pulled and really thought I'd be able to maintain my weight eating orally. And that just didn't happen. I felt like a failure. Every day my husband would leave for work and I would write down everything I'd eat and say, okay, I'm going to do it this time. Today is going to be a good day. And unfortunately, I just wasn't able to do it. And I ultimately lost all of the weight that I gained and then some. And in December of 2010, got my PEG-J placed, which it was a precutaneous gastrostomy jejunostomy. I think I said that right. Probably didn't, because I never say it. That's not a term I use because I got it early. And then you'll see later, I switched to a different one. But anyway, so I spent the next 3 months trying to figure out the right formula for me. It sounded like Mickey experienced something similar. I was lucky because I had a very dedicated dietitian who was willing to work with me, take the time to listen and ask the right questions for me to find the right formula. And then when my balloon popped in, I'm trying to kind of select the highlights because obviously over 10 years, lots happens. When I had my first tube malfunction, my balloon popped, and I met a great interventional radiologist who I'll talk a little bit more about later, but he suggested considering a low profile GJ tube, which I did have placed in August of that year. And from that moment on, I was on a mission to figure out my new normal. And that included continuing to explore what was going on, the extent of my condition, because I knew it was something more than just gastroparesis, because it was affecting not just my stomach. And so I ultimately received a unifying diagnosis at the Mayo Clinic in June of 2012 of post-viral gastroenteropathy causing severe dysmotility throughout my whole GI tract. So it wasn't just my stomach, even though I felt like, well, I was puking and I was nauseated and things like that. That was the result of blockage further down as well, or slow transit further down as well. I figured out things like not all fibers are created equal, and navigated ongoing issues with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But I also got comfortable feeding in public and learned to go with the flow of living with a chronic condition. And also, and this is a continuous thing, the pursuit of balance. And so all of this came to a crescendo in June of 2015 when I received an email that there were still scholarships being offered for the Oley conference. Now, I was on a consulting project that ended early. I had just returned home from my grandfather's funeral, and the timing was right for me to finally check out what Oley was all about. We hadn't budgeted for a trip to Saratoga Springs, so I accepted the scholarship and went on my way to a whole new world, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, as well as on Friday. So I'll skip to the past fall of 2019, when I started to experience a new set of symptoms. Without going into too much gory detail, bloody diarrhea, severe abdominal pain. It really was the worst pain of my life. And it was new and different compared to what I'd experienced for the previous 9 years. I ended up being diagnosed with non-infective pancolitis, which was basically inflammation across my whole colon from the beginning all the way to the end. And that December of 2019, I got a loop ileostomy, which was in the works prior to my diagnosis of pancolitis. I don't know that I would have ever gotten it had I not had that episode of colitis, because it was so bad. What my surgeon was trying, I'd been encouraged to get my colon removed several times by several different specialists, because they said that that was the worst area, my slowest area in my GI tract. And it was basically creating a log jam where nothing else had anywhere to go, because it would just sit in my colon for a long period of time. They called it colonic inertia. So even though I had already seen a surgeon that August, I was trying to warm up to the idea I may not have ever had the procedure had I not gone through this traumatic experience that October. So I had the loop ileostomy. It was to test the theory if I wasn't using my colon, if I would feel better, if I'd be able to tolerate more orally. And the truth is, it worked. I was feeling better. I was able to tolerate some very bland foods orally in small portions. However, so from December to early March, I was doing better. And then all of a sudden, almost on a monthly basis, sometimes even more frequently, I started having recurring non-infective pancolitis. And it got to the point I tried the month of June last year. I spent, I can be open with you all. I think that's what this is all about. I spent the month doing 2 enemas a day, trying to avoid having surgery. And one was a steroid, and one was a short chain fatty acid, and they didn't work. And so ultimately I had my colon removed and had complications. I had my ileostomy takedown surgery where it was reversed. But I'll fast forward to coming home on HPN, home parenteral nutrition, and then transitioning back to home enteral nutrition in November. And now I'm back to figuring out a new normal, and I'm back on tube feeds. So I tried to go through that quickly and lay it out for those visual people to kind of give you an idea of what my story's been, because everyone has a different story and this may not apply to everyone. But I also want to have you look at the top right of the screen where I have noted that I have a GJ tube, which starts in my stomach and ends in my jejunum, which is the part of the small intestine in between the duodenum and the ileum, sorry. And since it's come up in the chat, I'll just share so that I don't have to be asked. I'll just tell you, I have a Mickey 18 French 3.0 millimeter. My size has ranged from 2.0 to 3.5 over the past 10 years, depending on if I've gained weight and things like that. I'm pump fed into the J portion of my tube, and I consume semi-elemental peptide-based formula, which means this nutritionally complete formula has already been broken down So nutrients like proteins and fats are broken down into smaller units to make them easier to digest. Okay, so now we can fast forward to, these are my tenets to managing a healthy attitude towards long-term tube feeding and living with a chronic condition. This is what I've learned over the past decade living on nutrition support. And my hope is that by the end of my talk, you'll learn something new, feel validated, or that something I said will reinforce something you already knew. I'd like to point out, these are kind of my tenets. I'll break them each down moving forward, but really the key thoughts are to assemble a care team that's right for you, to learn, so be curious, ask questions, do your homework, join organizations like Oley, engage, find your tribe, find the people that will help love you and support you during these challenges, and to travel outside your comfort zone. Also to serve. For me, serving has been a huge part of finding peace with everything. Volunteering, advocating, mentoring, and stretching your role. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then at the end, I'll focus more on acceptance, going with the flow of living with a chronic condition, not letting it define you, being self-aware, trying to have a good sense of humor, and then choosing joy. And I'd like to point out at the bottom, you'll note that I put persistence, because each of those really, each of these tenets, persistence is key. And while it can be exhausting, it definitely pays off. So the first thing I'll focus on is assemble. So assemble a care team that's right for you. It's hard to know where to begin. And one way to address this is just asking for referrals. So I found that when I first got sick, I started with the doctor I was assigned when I went to the hospital, but I ultimately ended up, the doctor you see on that screen there, he became my doctor in January of 2011. About 6 months into my journey, a friend from CDC recommended him. That was my third doctor in a 6-month period, and he's still my doctor to this day. So assembling a care team that's right for you, you're not going to click with every clinician, so it's okay. It's important to find the right fit. If at first you don't succeed, try again. It's also okay to get a second opinion, or a third, or a fourth, depending on how long you're at it. Well, I quickly received the diagnosis of gastroparesis. It was clear that something more than just my stomach was being impacted. And I was fortunate to have a GI doctor who spoke up when he said, you know what, we're outside my area of expertise. I want to refer you to someone who I trained under. And I saw his colleague, and then ultimately ended up at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where I finally received a full understanding of the extent of my condition. That took about 2.5 years. And again, I know I'm lucky, because a lot of people endure a lot more than that and trying to figure things out. The next thing that's really important, or at least I've found has helped, is setting realistic expectations. Now, ideally, the members of your care team will be familiar with enteral nutrition and collaborate to ensure the best care coordination possible. If they don't, and it's important to you, it's okay to find new members of your care team who will meet your expectations. It's not unreasonable to wish to have a care team that understands nutrition therapy and will work together to achieve the best care possible for you. Sometimes we're left to feel like, we shouldn't ask questions, or should just accept the way things are. I'm here to tell you, it's okay to question. And we'll see a little bit more of that on the next slide. It's also okay to advocate for yourself. In fact, I encourage it, and I'll talk more about that later as well. And finally, it's never too late to establish with a new provider. Remember, you're the customer. Okay, so the next thing I find as a tenet is to learn. Be curious, ask questions, do your homework, AKA research. These concepts apply on so many levels. I could spend an entire day just talking about this, but instead I'll share a couple examples with you. I'll start off by saying that in my opinion, until recently, maybe the past decade or two, as patients or consumers, we've been accepted to just accept what our doctors have told us and not question or take part in our care, like I said earlier. Thankfully, that's no longer the standard. Patients and family members and caregivers are considered, or at least should be, and if you're not, then, and you want to be, you can do something about it. So when I say be curious, I also mean innovate. If what you need doesn't exist, or what you're being given doesn't work for you, create a solution that does. An example of this for me was retrofitting a Lululemon backpack that Emma, an HPN consumer, a friend of mine, recommended to me. You'll see several, if you go to an Oley conference, when we return to in person, you'll see several of us with this backpack. The photos on the bottom left of the screen are an example of how I took the run all day backpack and made it work for me. The reason I really wanted to do this was because my pump seemed to occlude a lot when I would either be hanging it from an IV pole or wearing it. And this was the backpack that I was given from my home care company. And so my back also got really sweaty when I would wear it for long periods of time without taking it off, like when I was volunteering at the hospital. And I found that this other backpack is much more comfortable and versatile. And I actually purchased quite a few off of eBay since they don't make them with the same features anymore. When I say ask questions, I also mean try new things. So explore available options on the market. If you'd like to try a different feeding regimen, product, treatment option, or device that you've learned about, ask your care team. Now, I will say it helps to come prepared with an article or a reference to reinforce your decision or argument, but it's also possible to discuss it with your team without that. Now, one of the first things I tried was one of the first new things I tried in my journey was a low profile feeding tube. Now, when I first got my tube, I hated the thing. At least that's how I felt for the first 8 months. My stoma was always inflamed. I didn't know what to do with the end where the heavy feeding and med ports were. If I let it hang, it caused more pain to my stoma. So I'd pin it to my clothing, but then that would make it harder to conceal. I felt constantly tethered, like I was on a leash. And it wasn't until my tube malfunctioned, which I mentioned earlier, my balloon popped. And I ended up meeting a kind and compassionate interventional radiologist who took the time to listen and talk to me about my goals and desire to be more active and feel less tethered. He asked me, have I ever considered a low profile feeding tube? I explained that I really didn't know much about them. So he went on to share the benefits with me and also some of the reservations I might have, but offered to measure me for one in case I wanted to try it out next time I needed to get my tube replaced. So he did. And I went home and I did some research. Then I scheduled an appointment with my GI doctor to discuss this with him. And ultimately, he was the one who had to put the orders in for me to get this tube. So now, while my GI doctor is one of the most caring, compassionate people I know, he wasn't fully on board initially. He said they take more care and maintenance and that they need to be replaced more frequently. And one of the things I like to remind folks at this point in my talk is that, again, I have a GJ tube. And all GJ tubes, not just low profile ones, need to be placed under fluoroscopy to make sure the end of the tube gets deep enough into the jejunum and the small intestine. That's what the J stands for, jejunum. So it does make it a little more complicated being able to switch it out at home, and they aren't as durable typically as a standard tube. So he had a point. But by the end of our conversation, I explained I'd done my research, weighed my options, and still really wanted to give it a try. So he said, okay. And all I can say is that getting my low profile GJ tube was a game changer. In many ways, it gave me my life back. It allowed me the freedom to live more actively and move more freely. I was able to return to doing activities like yoga and swimming without it feeling bothersome. And I no longer felt like I was constantly tethered on a leash. People can't really see it under my clothes. And when I'm feeding, it just looks like I'm wearing a backpack. In fact, people often say to me, take your backpack off and stay a while. And I have to explain that I'm actually feeding. Before getting it, I'd sit at home hooked up to an IV pole and didn't feel comfortable feeding in public. That meant I'd either deprive myself of much needed nutrition to attend social gatherings, or I'd turn down the invitation altogether. I'm not entirely sure what it was about getting the low profile tube, but it unlocked something new in me, and it empowered me and gave me the confidence I needed to not let feeding get in my way of life. Now, I just think of it as another way to eat. Another new thing that I tried was a different feeding regimen. In case you don't know this, I didn't initially. You don't need to stay on the schedule they give you when you leave the hospital. That schedule is convenient for the nursing staff and may not suit your daily routine. You can find a feeding schedule that works for you. Of course, you should do this with your prescribing doctor and or a dietitian. Like Hannah's mom said, you can do things that don't seem orthodox. Now, this didn't happen for me right away in my journey. It came about when I wanted to be more active, especially after getting my low profile feeding tube, as well as when I was more comfortable feeding in public. So for those not familiar, again, I feed into my small intestine, not my stomach. So that means I can only tolerate a slower rate than someone who's feeding into their stomach. So I was continuously feeding, probably about 18 hours a day at the time. And I found that if I fed exclusively, basically I'd start in the evening, feed overnight, and then finish in the late morning. And by midday, definitely by the end of the day, I felt so spent and depleted. I also wasn't getting great sleep at the time, and having my pump go off certainly wasn't helping. So I adjusted my feeding schedule. And I still to this day do this based on how I'm feeling, what my schedule looks like. If I need more sleep, I can break it up and do, half at one time of the day and the other half overnight or whatever. Something else that's really I like to think about when it comes to learning, it's also doing your homework and doing your research. And for me, it really helped that I had training in public health and had access to medical journals when I first got sick. This was before the era of fake news, but I definitely recognized the need to be critical of online information. So I won't go into details on that, but just know that anytime you see something from the Oley Foundation website or somewhere like the International Foundation for Gastrointestinal Disorders, you can trust that because it's been reviewed by a medical professional physician. But it's also good to, engage online. It can be good and it can be bad, but just know what to look out for, and also be aware that it's easy to become obsessed about researching. I know that I did when I first got sick. And so it's easy. It's something that worked for me was setting ground rules after, otherwise I'd spend all day researching on the internet. So I would just give myself a couple hours every week, to a handful of hours that I could spread out across the week or use all at once. And then once I was done, I was done. Anyway, when it comes to learning, again, it's never too late to learn. After more than 10 years on enteral nutrition, I learn every day. I didn't know about the enteral tube wallet card that Lisa Epp mentioned in the session before me. And just the other day, even though I've been doing this for 10 years, I was talking to someone and was trying to figure out a way to avoid my GJ coiling up into my stomach, because that's happened before. And so I'm thinking about maybe just getting a J tube, because I don't really use the G portion of my tube to decompress or vent. So the next thing I would say is join, engage, find your tribe, travel outside your comfort zone. These are just some pictures of some incredible people that I've met through Oley over the years. Some of you might recognize yourselves. But when it comes to Oley, some people may only need feeding therapy for a short period of time, just a few months. And that's what I thought mine would be when my journey began. But it's entirely possible that someone may just need it for a few months. They may discover the Oley Foundation, check it out, and then be done with it and move on. But for some of us who are on it longer, we might discover it midway through our journey. I did. It took me 5 years to really engage with Oley. And so I'll just say that I can remember coming home from the hospital on HPN and tube feeds and feeling overwhelmed and tired and uneducated. And when the home care nurse finally came to teach me and my husband how to tube feed, we received very little information, and the person who came to give this information had lack of experience with adult populations. And at that time, I vowed that I wanted to learn everything I could to prevent this from happening to anyone else. And when I became an Oley ambassador, that truly, I found my way to accomplish that. We, just like many of the ambassadors you've probably met, as well as members, we do our best to provide support, education, and resources. And then the last thing on this slide I'll just say is, it may require you to travel outside your comfort zone. I know it did for me, but as soon as I found my people, I was embraced by the community of people like me. If this is your first Oley conference, it's virtual, but when you're in person walking around, people are going to have their backpacks on. You're going to hear pumps going off. You may see somebody feeding at the table. It's all normal. We're all doing it. And there's nothing quite like it. And I'll be sharing more about that on my session on Friday. The next slide, I'll just mention, because I know I'm running low on time. Serve. So for me, serving, volunteering, advocating, mentoring, most people will tell you, you get, when it comes to volunteering, what you give, you usually receive more in return. And for myself, I find this to be true. advocating for yourself, for your loved ones, for others, for policies that can improve the quality of life for consumers and caregivers. You can mentor, and this can be formal or informal. If you look at the longer picture on the left, bottom left of the screen, you will see Leanne. And I actually met Leanne's mom in the bathroom at the Oley conference in Connecticut. I think, yeah, it was Connecticut. And she came up to me and she said, "Oh my gosh, how are you wearing a dress while you're feeding?" And I showed her how it was that dress that I have on that picture. I showed her how I thread it through my armpit and how, yeah, I just do it this way. I clip it to my bra and there it is. And she wanted to introduce me to her daughter, and I showed her, and she's like, "I want to do that too." And it connected her with Cynthia Reddick, one of our wonderful dietitians who's always supportive of Oley. And it really improved her quality of life, so much so that, I don't know, it might have been 6 or 8 months later, she sent me a picture of her wearing her backpack at church, and she looked great. And so it's that kind of thing that can really make a difference. I often serve as a resource to consumers and caregivers awaiting discharge on home enteral nutrition, but it doesn't stop there. I get calls, just like many of our early ambassadors from around the country. And what's really interesting? I'll hear from tubies who've had tubes for years, and they may be calling me because they're having an issue with their stoma and granulation tissue or infection, or it's inflamed. And a lot of time it really comes down to poor fit, and that just shouldn't happen, and we can prevent it. So I just wanted to put a plug in for that. I can also say that over the past 12 months, 2 of my closest friends had immediate family members placed on tube feeds with very little to no education upon discharge. And I've gone over in the middle of the night, or have used FaceTime during the pandemic to try and help them troubleshoot. That's the kind of thing any of us can do. You don't have to sign up as an Oley ambassador to provide that kind of support and resource. And a concept from Peggy's talk at Aspen was to stretch your role. For me, this means to extend beyond the traditional role as a Oley ambassador or board member. I became an ambassador as soon as I returned from the conference in 2015. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to mention the gentleman in the red and white striped shirt. He's an older gentleman. When I came home from the Oley conference in 2015, the day after I got home, his family was like, "We need you to talk to Bob because he needs a feeding tube and he doesn't want one." And he's a success story. He just turned 92. And I told him when he was sick, I'm like, "If you get off this, I'm going to bake you cookies whenever you want." And I continue to this day. Serving as an Oley ambassador board of trustee member has been an honor and a privilege, probably the greatest honor of my life. I've had the opportunity to blend my public health experience and serve on work groups that address things like safety and ensuring medical nutrition access and equity. Stretching my role again, I never thought I'd end up as a participant in an FDA listening session. In 2017, I was asked to talk about my experience with ENFIT, but the new enteral connectors that you heard Lisa talk about earlier. I'm always happy to provide my perspective, but I hadn't yet transitioned. So what did I do? I transitioned to ENFIT in 2017. I got in touch with my home care company and said, "I want to transition to ENFIT. I live in Georgia." We haven't transitioned still to this day, but I did at that time because it was important to me to honestly speak about my experience. And so I've had a very positive one. I love not feeding the bed or getting formula all over my clothes or my house when I disconnect, have a disconnection. But I will mention, since it came up in the chat, that it's worked incredibly well for me for feeding through my J. I haven't had great success venting or draining through the G portion of my tube. And so I'll also note that I have a low profile tube, which is also a small bore, and it's never worked well for venting or draining. So that's just something to consider. I'm going to skip ahead to my last slide. And really, it comes down to acceptance. Mickey and Hannah both did an incredible job sharing about having a positive attitude and really what I like to call choosing joy. For me, it's come down to not letting it define me, not letting having a feeding tube be everything about my life. It's about finding balance and finding other areas of my life to develop. So these pictures kind of highlight the different activities I'm involved in. But, I had to do something other than focus on feeding tubes and being sick. And so I volunteer at my local hospital. I serve as an officer for my local alumni chapter and a collegiate chapter for my sorority. And I just love serving the community. Um, I will say, though, that one of the most incredible um, changes in my life happened when I learned to go with the flow of having a chronic condition instead of resisting it. It made a huge difference. When I finally surrendered and accepted that a feeding tube is just another way to eat and sustain myself, it felt like I stopped fighting the current and finally could just float away um, and relax. And so I also think being self aware is super important. Um, it can take time when you're transitioning to a new therapy or a life change to become self-aware, and so it comes with time, but I think it's important to keep it top of mind. And I also think having a sense of humor is really important. I do not have a great sense of humor. I've historically taken myself too seriously. So my husband helps me with that on a regular basis, and so do my friends. I saw a question that came up earlier in the chat about eating at a restaurant with family and friends. I'll be speaking more about this um, actually, I think, yeah, I'm Friday. I'm going to be talking about choosing joy. That is, I thought it was beautiful that both Hannah and Mickey mentioned this. Um, but as it comes to eating at a restaurant, I found that for myself, cooking has helped me keep a healthy relationship with food. I know that doesn't work for everyone, but for me, when I invest love and intention into what I'm making or baking for someone, it really goes a long way. And I'll also go on what my friends will call faux coffee or faux lunch dates. And it's really helped me a lot to do that kind of thing. It doesn't bother me to be around people eating. I know that's not the case for everyone. And I more recently have started eating more orally by mouth more recently. And so it's definitely a different transition. But I will say that whether you're new to tube feeding or you've been doing it for years, I encourage you to take a look at the tenets that I've shared today and engage in the areas you haven't explored yet. And I think I'm out of time, so I am going to stop my share and say thank you.